July 2, 1944. The underground hospital cave near Cherbourg was heavy with the smell of blood, smoke, and boiled bandages. Dr. Schwester stepped slowly out of the subterranean darkness, her white coat hanging loosely from her frail shoulders. Her hands lifted in surrender, trembling as her eyes met the blinding daylight she hadn't seen in days. Just hours earlier, she had stood beneath the flickering light of a candle, her voice steady as she told her fellow nurses, "The Americans cannot possibly have the medical supplies they claim. This must be propaganda to break our morale." But now, with her feet sinking into the mud outside, those words already felt like relics from another lifetime. Behind her, 8 German army nurses emerged into the sunlight, pale, exhausted, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. They were among the first German nurses captured by American forces in France. In those final desperate days of the siege, they had treated endless waves of wounded Wehrmacht soldiers by candlelight, rationing the last drops of morphine, boiling and reusing bandages until they fell apart. They had long stopped believing in victory, but still clung to the idea of German superiority. None of them could have imagined what they were about to see. When Colonel Richard P. Johnson of the U.S. 45th Evacuation Hospital saw the surrendering nurses, he did not see enemies. He saw colleagues, fellow healers trapped on the opposite side of a war that devoured compassion. Under the Geneva Convention, these women would soon be returned to their own lines. But before that, they would step into a world of medicine so far beyond their imagination that it would forever change what they believed was possible. That awakening, however, had begun long before the caves of Cherbourg. A year earlier, in May 1943, General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim had surrendered in Tunisia, marking the end of the German campaign in North Africa. Among the 250,000 Axis soldiers who laid down their weapons were thousands of doctors, medics, and nurses of the German Red Cross, many of them veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps. Women like Ilse Schultz and Greta Falk, both decorated with the Iron Cross for bravery, had spent 2 brutal years in desert warfare, battling dehydration, infection, and death itself with dwindling supplies. They believed they had seen the worst the world could offer. They were wrong. In captivity, they encountered something they had never been prepared for, not cruelty, not humiliation, but abundance. The Americans throw away more medical supplies in a day than we receive in a month, one nurse wrote in disbelief. They have medicines we have only heard about. The shock began the moment they boarded the Liberty ships that would carry them away from Africa. These enormous steel vessels, mass-produced in staggering numbers, were everything Nazi propaganda said was impossible. Inside their medical bays, the captured nurses found bright electric light instead of flickering candles, polished instruments instead of rusted ones, and neatly labeled cabinets filled with sterile bandages and morphine ampoules. For women used to working in tents where sandstorms coated open wounds, the ship's medical facilities felt almost unreal. There were X-ray machines, cold storage for blood plasma, and full refrigeration for medicines. The Americans even stored pre-packaged blood plasma, something the Germans had dismissed as a fantasy. When they arrived in the United States, the surprises deepened. Upon entering POW camps, German nurses underwent full medical examinations. They were given dental care, new eyeglasses, and treatments for chronic illnesses that had been ignored for years. They were fed generously, fresh vegetables, meat, milk, and at Christmas, they received packages containing chocolate, cigarettes, and soap. To women raised on propaganda that portrayed Americans as greedy and decadent, this simple humanity was disarming. Some cried silently when they realized that prisoners here lived better than civilians in Germany. In places like Opelika, Alabama, German nurses were assigned to work in American military hospitals. There, they encountered technology decades ahead of what they had known. Surgical lamps that could be adjusted with a touch, autoclaves that sterilized equipment in minutes, electric cauterization tools that stopped bleeding instantly, and pharmacies stocked with hundreds of medicines. But the most miraculous discovery came in a small, unlabeled bottle: penicillin. The miracle drug America was producing by the billions. For nurses who had watched soldiers die from infected wounds, gangrene, or sepsis, penicillin was nothing short of magic. Where the Germans would have amputated, the Americans healed. Where the Germans saw young men wither away in agony, the Americans restored them to health within days. The sight of these recoveries stunned the German nurses. One of them later wrote, "It was as if we were watching life itself return from the dead." And then came a revelation even more earth-shattering than the medicine itself. Many of the nurses they worked with in American hospitals were black women, educated, skilled, and commanding authority. These women gave orders to white doctors, corrected German techniques, and saved lives with quiet confidence. To the German nurses, who had been indoctrinated from youth with Nazi racial ideology, this was a reality they had been told could not exist. Everything they had been taught about race, civilization, and superiority began to crumble before their eyes. Captivity, which had begun in fear and shame, was slowly transforming into an education, a moral and professional awakening. By 1944, as more German medical personnel were captured, the U.S. military began organizing formal training programs in American medical practices. German nurses learned about sterilization, vaccination, epidemic control, and the importance of public health. They read from American medical textbooks and realized, with growing horror, that many of the scientific discoveries they were now studying had been made by Jewish scientists their own government had persecuted or murdered. That realization broke something deep within them. For nurses who had once believed medicine served ideology, this new understanding was devastating and liberating. Medicine, they began to see, was not a tool of race or politics. It existed for one purpose: to heal. They saw this truth play out in front of them every single day. American doctors treated wounded German POWs with the same precision and care they gave to their own soldiers. There was no shouting, no humiliation, just quiet efficiency and compassion. One captured nurse later wrote, "They treated our wounded as though they were their brothers." The contrast with their own experience in German field hospitals was almost unbearable. Back home, medicine had become an instrument of ideology. In the Reich, healing was reserved for those deemed worthy. But in American hospitals, the nurses saw something revolutionary: care given without prejudice, guided only by science and humanity. By the time 1944 turned into 1945, hundreds of German medical workers in captivity had been trained in these American methods. They learned how to organize hospital wards, how to prevent infection, how to manage epidemics through vaccination and sanitation. They witnessed the importance of teamwork, where nurses were trusted as professionals rather than mere assistants to doctors. For many of these women, the lessons ran deeper than medicine. They had been taught that mercy was weakness. But in American hospitals, they discovered that mercy was strength, that compassion could be a weapon more powerful than hate. One nurse, years later, recalled the moment that changed her forever. A young American doctor had stayed up all night to save the life of a severely wounded German prisoner. When she asked him why he would exhaust himself for an enemy, he simply replied, "Because he's a human being. That's enough." That sentence, she said, was worth more than any propaganda she had ever heard. When the war finally ended in 1945, the nurses returned to a Germany in ruins. Cities lay in ashes, hospitals were shells of their former selves, and disease spread through the population unchecked. Millions were starving, homeless, or sick. But the women who came back from captivity brought something the Reich could never have given them: knowledge and perspective. They began rebuilding, one ward at a time. Using what they had learned in American hospitals, they founded new nursing schools, established blood banks, and introduced antibiotic treatments. They taught hygiene, nutrition, and modern patient care. They emphasized teamwork, discipline, and empathy, the same values they had once seen as foreign or even un-German. Slowly, a new German medical philosophy began to emerge, one no longer built on ideology, but on humanity. Some of these nurses would go on to become pioneers in post-war German healthcare. Others would spend their lives in quiet service, never speaking publicly about what they had witnessed. But all of them carried the same conviction, that medicine must never again serve politics, race, or war. It must serve life. Many years later, a few of them gathered for reunions in the 1960s and 70s. They spoke softly of the years behind barbed wire, not as prisoners, but as witnesses to transformation. One of them wrote, "We arrived as prisoners. We left as witnesses to medicine's true purpose." That statement would come to define one of World War II's quietest but most profound victories. For while the world remembers D-Day, Stalingrad, and the atomic bomb, there was another kind of triumph taking place, not on the battlefield, but in hospital tents and prison camps. A victory not of force, but of compassion and knowledge. Through the overwhelming medical superiority of the Allies, and through the humanity with which it was wielded, the United States achieved something no propaganda or ideology could withstand: the transformation of belief. By showing mercy where others expected cruelty, by healing where others destroyed, the Americans turned enemies into witnesses. For the German nurses, what began as defeat became enlightenment. They had seen a different world, a world where science and empathy worked hand in hand, where medicine was not an arm of power, but a sanctuary from it. Years later, when asked about those days, one former nurse said, "We thought we were the healers. But in truth, it was we who needed healing." And perhaps that was the greatest medical victory of all. Because while the war was won with tanks and guns, its most enduring conquest came quietly, in the minds and hearts of those who had once served the Reich, and who left captivity believing in something far greater than empire or ideology. They returned home changed forever. They rebuilt hospitals, retrained generations of nurses, and passed on the lessons they had learned in captivity, that true medicine knows no enemy, no flag, no race. It was a victory of compassion over cruelty, of evidence over illusion, of humanity over hate. And through them, through these nurses who once walked out of the shadows of a blood-soaked cave near Cherbourg, America's greatest medical victory lived on. not in the destruction of its enemies, but in the healing of their hearts.